Hello, I am Barbara Mandigo, and this is the LVT Academy on Rural Education. That's right, I said I am Barbara Mandigo. Let me tell you how that happened. This is not a question of transgender, or it's not a question of a sex operation to change something. No, here's what happened. When Angelo Perciabali accepted my suggestion for an academy on rural education, I was delighted. I immediately sat down and began writing. Look at this, just typed out page after page. I've got so much in my head about rural education, it was hard to gather it all together. But about 10 days ago, or 2 weeks ago, I fell. I broke my arm, excuse me. I broke my arm, I've got it in a cast now, and I bruised my leg so badly that I have a hard time standing up. So I phoned up Charlie Woolfolk, and I said, Charlie, I've got to give an academy on rural education, but I'm not physically up to it right now. Will you be me? And Charlie said, sure, he'd be happy to do that. So here I am, Barbara Mandigo, talking to you about rural education. Rural education, how could that be of any interest to anybody? Well, let me tell you, there's an awful lot to it. Let's start at the beginning here, the beginning of this country. You know, this is an agricultural country. Come to think of it, let's do think of it. Who do you think the founders were? They were farmers. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson. Holy smoke. Everybody was a farmer back in the beginning. If you weren't a farmer, you were a lawyer, or maybe a printer like Benjamin Franklin. But 9 out of 10 of them were farmers. We had an agricultural economy. When we became a nation, every public work was largely done to improve agricultural production. Back in 1825, for example, we built the Erie Canal. We brought over a lot of miners from Wales, say, who were good with a shovel to dig by hand the Erie Canal. That was for moving farm products. Those farmers later became, those diggers later became farmers themselves. There are 2 lessons I want to say I'm going to impart to you today when talking about rural education. And one of them is, nothing stays the same. That's another way of saying change is inevitable. The other lesson is what I would call interconnectedness. Boy, that's a mouthful, isn't it? Interconnectedness. What does that mean? Well, it means if you pull a rope over here, something's going to pop up over there. It will happen every time you push something here, something comes up over there. It's remarkable. We'll get back to that. There are 3 things I want to talk about in rural education. One of them is the one-room schoolhouse. The other one is Cornell University. And the other one is the Grange. Before I get into that, let me tell you a little about myself. I'm a New Yorker, a native New Yorker. I grew up in the little town of Lansing, just a little outside of Ithaca, New York. You know where Ithaca is? It's like sort of in the middle of the States, best known for being up on the banks of Cayuga, one of the Finger Lakes. Anybody who's been up Route 81, you know I-81? Well, you go up through Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, and so on, then you get into New York, Binghamton, work your way on up to Syracuse, keep going. Well, halfway between Binghamton and Syracuse is Ithaca, a little off to the west. You keep on going, you'll pass Pulaski. Pulaski is important because that's where I lived for a long time in my life. But when I grew up in Lansing, I was just outside of Ithaca. We had back then one-room schoolhouses. Those were set up by New York in the early 1800s. They had to be in populated areas 4 miles apart. There's a lesson right there. No child had to walk more than 2 miles to get to school. People did that back in those days. 2 miles to get to school. Think of that. And the school teacher in a one-room school was part of your community. She might be your mother's best friend. And you better not give her any sass, I'll tell you that. I'm going to give you some anecdotes as I go along. And by the way, my talk's liable to be quite disjointed. I've got so much information in my head, it's really hard to sort it all out. And just things will come bubbling up and I'll share them with you. In Lansing, we had about 20 students. It was a pretty populated area around there in this one-room school. And my teacher was named Mrs. Munson. That's right, Mrs. We didn't have any Ms. back then. Mrs. Munson. Mrs. Munson was a Dutch lady, strangely enough. She had married Mr. Munson, who was from Ithaca. He had gone over to the University of Beirut. You know where that is? In Syria. It was Syria then, to teach English for $500 a year. And he met Mrs. Munson. Well, it wasn't Mrs. Munson then. He met his wife there. She was from Holland and teaching English also at the University of Beirut. They later came back to Lansing, and she taught school, and he became the superintendent of schools in Tompkins County. That's amazing, isn't it? The whole world gets involved in this stuff. If you were a teacher in a one-room school, you did more than teach. You had to get up early, get to that school, and get the fire going in the stove. Winters in New York are not warm. So you either had to have coal in the coal bin or you had to firewood if it was a wood stove. Get that thing going before the children arrived. Let's get back to no child further than 2 miles apart. One-room schools taught from 1 to 8, grades 1 to 8. Why, Nancy Richards, she grew up in New York, not far from where I was, but her school only had 6 to 8 students. Nancy would rumble down there to her school. Finally, she got complaints from her teacher and told her mom that Nancy was coming late. When her mom asked Nancy, "Why are you late to school?" Nancy said, "Well, sometimes we follow the dog tracks through the woods because the dogs went to school with the kids, not necessarily following them right along, but they would just take off, but eventually end up at the school. And sometimes Nancy and her friends would follow those dog tracks." Now there's a lesson for you right there. The difference between a straight line and a curved line. There are all kinds of lessons in rural education. The farm itself is a lesson day after day. Let me tell you a little story about that. In the Second World War, 2 of my younger brothers joined the Navy. They were going in the submarine corps. When they got out of boot camp, or got their assignment, an officer asked them, "What farm are you boys from?" They were wondering, "Sir, why do you ask that?" said, well, we know you farm boys have a sense of responsibility, and we know that you plan ahead, and we know that you get it done, so welcome aboard. How about that? That's what you learn at farm life, not in any school. You learn responsibility, planning ahead, time management. It's a wonderful thing, rural education. Oh boy, I have so much to tell you, because most of what I'm going to talk about doesn't exist anymore. Gone with the wind. You know, the high schools weren't like that. The high schools might not be within 4 miles of each other. I remember once my older brother and sister had to hook up a horse to a buggy every morning to go off to high school. When they got there, they would put the horse and buggy in the shed next to the church. Did I tell you that wherever there was a school, usually there was a church nearby? Well, the church would have a shed for the horse and buggies of Sunday worshipers. Oh, the school kids would just put their horse and buggies in the church's shed. They learned responsibility there. You better keep that shed clean. That's what rural life is like, and it was in New York anyway, and what I'm telling you probably applied in most of the 48 states. Yes, I said 48 states, because there weren't 50 when a lot of this I'm telling you about was going on. So we had Mrs. Munson teaching us. We had the mom and dad telling us to mind our P's and Q's. And when you were in school, once a day, the teacher would teach a single subject to every kid in that school. This is grades 1 to 8. Let's say geography. The teacher would teach geography to everyone at the same time. When it came to reading, writing, and arithmetic, the teacher would separate the grades out, the children apart from each other, give them each lessons to do, and the older ones would frequently teach the younger ones. How about that for learning cooperation and responsibility? Oh, it went on like that, day after day. It was great fun and a great learning experience. Believe it or not, in New York State, you know, most pre-college, let's call it that, pre-college school are grades 1 through 12. Well, in New York, they had a grade 13. It wasn't a whole year, but if you wanted to be a teacher in a New York one-room school, you had to go to grade 13. It was just a few months in which they taught you all the responsibilities of a teacher and what to do. With that certificate from grade 13, you could get a teaching job for 3 years. If you wanted to be a teacher for life, of course you had to go on and take summer school courses at a college, and the state set up eventually teachers' colleges, set them up all around the state. Eventually, those teachers' colleges became the basis for the State University of New York, SUNY, the SUNY system, headquartered in Albany. But you've all heard now of the SUNY Binghamton, SUNY Cortland, SUNY at Stony Brook. Some of these SUNYs are outstanding universities. Lots of people here at LVT, by the way, are from New York. They know what I'm talking about. Many of them, they've been to these one-room schools. They've been to a SUNY. So you check with them if you think I'm giving you any baloney. I myself went on, thought about becoming a teacher. Now I want to tell you a little something about Cornell University. Here, I want you to look at this magazine. Here's a picture on the cover of the Cornell magazine that shows you Ezra Cornell. Let's talk a little about this now. Back in 1862, the Federal Congress passed the Morrill Act. That's right, the Morrill Act, which set up land-grant colleges. You know how that happened? They gave federal land to the states. Every congressional district got 30,000 acres of federal land that it could sell to get money to build an agricultural institute. The institutes were for agriculture and mechanical arts. Let me tell you about how it happened in New York. There was a young whippersnapper named Andrew White. Andrew White. He's got himself elected to the New York Senate. By the way, the Morrill Act was 1862. Andrew White was in the New York Senate. He was head of the Senate's Literary Committee. Can you imagine that? A literary committee. That's a fancy name for the Education Committee. You don't have to be a Madison Avenue advertising whiz to whip up flowery language. They could do it in the New York legislature. And a fellow named Ezra Cornell, who was from Ithaca, New York, he was in the Senate too, and he was head of the Agriculture Committee. These two guys put their heads together and decided they were going to set up the land-grant college in Ithaca. I didn't tell you that more than being a senator and head of the Agriculture Committee, Ezra Cornell had made a bundle with some company called Western Union. Boy, did he have a lot of money. And the way he got that, Cornell, he offered $30,000, 300 acres of land, and to build a building to house the students. Well, you can't beat that. That's how Cornell University got started in 1865. Something else was going on in 1865. This was April when Cornell was set up. In May, some fellow named Robert E. Lee was handing his sword over to another fellow named Ulysses S. Grant down in Appomattox. Can you imagine that? The federal government was looking ahead back during the Civil War and setting up these programs for rural education. Well, Cornell got going and it became an outstanding university. It was the crown jewel of land-grant colleges. As you know, today it's an Ivy League university. Back in the early days, you know, to go to Cornell, you had to prove that you were a farmer or you knew something about agricultural life. They had tests for applicants. You had to know how to bridle a horse and demonstrate it, or something like that. That's gone with the wind now. They don't have that anymore. Why would they have that? Well, as soon as they set up a very fine school, people started applying from all over. They weren't necessarily farmers, but this was supposed to be an agricultural and mechanical institute. Yes, a lot of that is gone with the wind. Anyway, I ended up going to Cornell, majoring in agricultural science, in the agricultural science department, majoring in dietary science. After I got out of school, I thought I would go teaching somewhere and was looking for a job when a university, a department official comes to me and said, "We have a job for you. How would you like a job?" Well, sure, what? This was in the Depression back in 1937. Said, we want you to be the 4-H agent for Oswego County. Now, remember me telling you how I-81 goes up past Syracuse and keeps on going? Well, it goes right through Oswego County as it makes its way up along the shores of Lake Ontario, heading for Canada. So I went up there and got an apartment, and I was the agent, the 4-H agent for that county, because other federal laws had set up 4-H, the Home Bureau, the Farm Bureau. Lots of things were happening with respect to rural life and rural education. We were a rural country. We had an agricultural economy. I tell you, I went up there and got myself an apartment. Now, what was my job there as a 4-H agent? By the way, do you know what the H's stand for? The 4-H club? They stand for head, heart, hand, and health. I bet you didn't know that, did you? Every club meeting, whenever I would go, we always said the pledge. I pledge my head for clearer thinking. I pledge my heart for greater loyalty. I pledge my hand for larger service. And I pledge my health for greater well-being. Oh, we said that, and I pledged this for my club, my county, my community, and my God. Can you believe that? They're still doing that today. There are still 4-H clubs out there. Let me tell you another thing. I'm just interject some things here from time to time. There was a fellow way back named Elkanah or Elkanah. I don't know how to pronounce that. Watson. How would you pronounce Elkanah? Wonder where that comes from. Anyway, Elkanah Watson was quite a traveler and quite a businessman in the Albany area. He set up the Bank of Albany, made quite a bit of money, visionary person. When he retired, he moved over into Massachusetts. You know, Albany is not too far from Massachusetts, right along the Hudson River. Albany is on one side. You don't have to go too far to hit the Massachusetts line. He was in Pittsfield. You know where Pittsfield is. And he's created there the Berkshire Agricultural Society. And he persuaded the Berkshire Agricultural Society one year in 1811 to have a cattle show. That's right, it was called a cattle show. But it wasn't just a show, it wasn't just an exhibition, it was a competition. $70 prize was offered for the best oxen, the best cattle, the best sheep, the best swine. That was the beginning of what we now call the county fair, which later became the state fair. There are now 2,000 county and state fairs in the United States and other countries of the world. Did I say something about interconnectedness? You push something here and something else pops up over there. Those things began what we now see on the corner of County Road 44 and County Road 450, down there where Stavros Restaurant is. That's the county fair that was begun back in 1811 by Elkanah Watson. It's just amazing how one thing creates another. How, you know, education, rural education. These fairs weren't just for the farm folk, but they were also for city folk to come and see and feel and touch. where their food comes from. And they've grown now beyond just the cattle. We have the best chickens, the best rabbits, you name it. There are all kinds of exhibitions and prize winners at these fairs. That's what it's all about. Most of us have forgotten that. We go now for the rides, the carny rides and things like that. But you see, that was all part of rural education. And one thing supports another. I'm telling you about 4-H, and suddenly I break off to tell you about county fairs. Why? Well, 4-H was for young people, and it would help them. It would instruct them in how to do rural things, how to do farm things. Let's talk about farming for a minute. You know, farming is what I'd call an unnatural science. You might go, what? An unnatural science? Well, let me put it this way. What's the natural condition out there in the fields? Well, it's the prairie overrun with buffalo. It's the forest with elk and deer and bears and wolves. That's what it is. To farm, you have to break that sod. You have to cut those trees and clear that land. That's unnatural. Everything wants to get back to nature, and I'll come back to that in a minute. That's where we're all going, and that's what we're about with farming, providing food for the population. It's not what it was in my day. It's not what it was in my father's day, but farming is still a major business. What do you see on television every night? Something about the food chain being in danger. Not enough meat, maybe not enough vegetables. We're in trouble if you can't get food. Well, back to 4-H. Yes, head, heart, hand, and health. My job as a 4-H agent was to set up clubs in the various villages in Oswego County. And every club had to have a leader. My job was also to have monthly meetings for the leaders. And for these meetings, a representative from Cornell University, maybe a county agent or a professor, would come and give instruction to these leaders who would go back to the clubs and teach the younger club members what they had learned at that lesson. And believe it or not, those club members would go home and teach their parents. That's rural education. You can see, did I say something about interconnectedness? It's all there, day after day after day. Oh, it's all gone with the wind. Just wonderful. The next thing I want to tell you about is the Grange. Most of you have heard of the Grange. How shall I put this? The Grange was established as a fraternity for farmers. That's right, a frat for farmers. Yes, Americans, we love such things as that, don't we? Yes, well, here was one set up along the lines of the Masons. Yes, the Grange. When I say the Grange, I'm referring to a village organization called the Grange. There were hundreds of them. The one in Pulaski was 760. Here you show the Grange booklet. I lost my train of thought there, talking to Leslie. So the Grange was set up as this fraternity along the lines of the Masons. But there's one big difference between the Masons and the Grange, and that is the treatment of the sexes. The Masons, that's a male organization, and they had their auxiliary called, I think it's the Blue Star. I'm not sure just what it is. But with the Grange, Men and women were treated equally. Oh, but we had a secret society like the Masons called a secret order. And we studied like the Masons. We moved up by degrees. And the degrees were the local, the county, the state, and national. You had to study hard. The Grange met twice a month, and at each meeting, a leader, someone trying to move up, would have to give a lecture on some agricultural subject. And that lecture, besides telling us the how to do with respect to farming, must also contain a moral lesson. It was just fascinating. I once headed in Pulaski, the Grange 730. We had 40 members. That was 40 different farms. We all wore sashes at the meeting. Oh, it provided some of the best potluck suppers, the best square dances, because the Grange and the church were the two focal points of social life for rural people. It was wonderful. Fact is, when I took over, we had just completed a new Grange Hall. It was beautiful, wonderful. Now, they have donated that Grange Hall to the local school board. And the school board uses it as a classroom for special education, how to teach children with learning disabilities. So there you have rural education. You have the school system. You have Cornell University providing constant scientific research. And you have the Grange. Now listen, the Grange was more than just this fraternity. The Grange had objectives for farmers, had goals. Let me tell you what they were. One of the goals was to teach farmers, encourage farmers to read and think. Imagine that as a goal. Read and think. Another goal was to encourage farmers to plant flowers and fruit. Imagine that. Plant flowers. Another was to encourage farmers to beautify their homes. You know, when you drive down the highway, maybe you drive down the highway in New York, say, you will see a beautiful farm, rolling hills, all green. You see the furrows going along. And there you will see a farmhouse surrounded by trees and flower gardens, the silo going up next to the barn. They're beautiful sights. You see them in the magazines. Photographers love that. Where do you think it came from? It came from the Grange. The Grange was to be a lobbying organization also for farmers. Would you believe that the Grange was influential in getting the Pure Food and Drug Act passed? But the most important thing the Grange ever did was to help pass rural free delivery. You've all heard of RFD. The Grange is largely responsible for that. So there we have the big three. The Grange also taught animal husbandry, crop rotation, education going on all the time. The human being is hungry for education. Here's another anecdote. Angelo Percivali had the idea a couple of years back of starting an academy here at LVT. Well, it took off like a house afire. Why? Because we're all hungry for education. Let me tell you a little something about my husband's family. Our ancestors came over here to this country as indentured servants indentured servants. They were under contract to work for a landowner in New York State. My husband's family worked for the Van Rensselaer family. You've heard of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute up in Troy, New York. After so many years under contract, each indentured servant was given a parcel of land, and that land was to provide that land. Also, it was like sharecropping. The indentured servant had to provide the landowner with a certain number of bushels of wheat, corn, whatever crop was in the contract. Here's the important thing, after so many years as an indentured servant, you were free, you were on your own, and you owned that land. It became yours. There's an enormous lesson in that. Private property. You own something. It's an asset for you, and you take care of it. It's the basis of the free enterprise economy. That's why most of the third world doesn't have that. Very few people own everything. The vast population doesn't own anything. But here in America, we started out giving property to people. It's been the greatest lesson we ever gave to the world. I'm Barbara Mandigo, and I've been talking about rural education. I want to remind you what it says in the book of Luke in the Bible. Chapter 6, verse 38. Give, and it shall be given to you, a heaping portion, pressed down, shaken, and spilling out into your lap. As you give, so shall it be given to you. Thank you, and have a great rural day.